Good evening, everybody. My name is Lauren Gramley, and welcome to the library. For those of you I've not met before, I am the business specialist here at the Champaign Public Library. I work with anybody interested in starting a small business or a nonprofit. We have a lot of great resources here at the library, from databases, do market research. You can book a one-on-one with me, the business specialist, and I will meet with you on all aspects of starting a business, from marketing and branding to funding to writing a business plan, doing market research. But probably my favorite part of being here at the library is getting to partner with a lot of great local entrepreneurs and experts in business and nonprofit here locally, including this evening's presenter. So I want to go ahead and introduce tonight's presenter. Shahar Maron, or is it Maron?
Shahar Maron.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sure.
That's all right.
Shahar Maron is a partner at Blue Green Branding, a brand strategy consultancy with a focus on B2B tech and financial companies. He has over 20 years experience in the world of marketing and advertising, having helped over 100 plus organizations, big and small. He also teaches advertising and brand strategy as a senior lecturer at the University of Illinois. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Shahar.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for having me. I really, I've spent so much of my career, I'll introduce my background in just a sec, but so much of my career working with small businesses. So I just love, conversations with people that live in that world, that have ideas, bring them to life and all that. Today I'm going to be talking about brand blueprints. I'll explain what that is in just a little bit. But the whole idea is how to help small businesses get their hands around brand strategy, something that feels sometimes really intangible. Sometimes there's a sense like it's important, but what does that actually mean? There's a lot of jargon in it. So trying to show kind of like what some of the most essential elements are of it, and then also give some resources for how people can do this on their own. So yeah, just what I'll walk through today. I'll do a little bit of intro, including introducing myself and just introducing, brands. What are they? You guys know what they are, but just kind of getting on the same page around what we're talking about here. Then getting into brand strategy. So that's when we're going to kind of dive into some of the elements of brands. There's so many of them. I'm not going to cover them all today, but I will hit on some of the most important ones. Then getting into how you actually define your brand. So like looking at those different brand elements and, how do you determine what's right for you? What are some of the inputs that you consider? What are some of the tools you use to derive it for your own brand? And then I'll wrap it up by showing brand blueprint, really, which is just an outline for how you can assemble this yourself. We'll go through a checklist of some of those things we talked about and can also revisit any of the things where you might need the most help. Just a little bit of background on myself. I have and you just heard a short intro on me, but I started in the world of advertising. I actually was a student here at the University of Illinois studying advertising, and after that spent some time in Chicagoland as an advertising agency guy. I started on the creative side as a writer and then creative director, and then also got involved in strategy. At one point, went and started an agency with a partner called Bates Marone. It's a brand design boutique. We grew it up into an agency of 8 to 10 people, something like 30 clients. Some of them were small businesses in Chicagoland. Others were like larger business to business or really niche kind of companies. Then after about 5 or 6 years of that, ended up selling my half to my partner, went back to agency life, and then was looking for sort of a change, little better work-life balance, and learned of an opportunity to teach down here at U of I, my alma mater. So 12 years ago, this is about halfway through my career now, came down here to start teaching full-time as a lecturer in the advertising department. I teach in advertising. There's also a Master's of Strategic Brand Communication program that I've taught in as well. And then also on the side of that, I have Blue Green Branding, which is a partnership and consultancy with a partner of mine. Together, we do tackle brand strategy consulting for business-to-business tech and financial companies. So a little bit of background on that. This is subject matter that I've done hands-on myself. This is subject matter that I teach to students on a regular basis. And then these are the types of things that I still do with clients ongoing. So yeah, just a little background so you know where this is all coming from. And then just to kind of like intro the topic that we're talking about here, we're talking about brands, which are a really broad kind of a concept. In fact, I like to tell students, we live in a world of brands. I have a really expansive look at what I consider brands. Brands are products that we use, the companies that make them, ingredients in things, the clothes that we wear and the games that we play and the food that we eat. Brands are all over the place. Brands are inseparable from our day-to-day lives. When we think about brands, we also typically have, specific brands we might have in our minds in different categories. There's tech brands, there's food brands, there's clothing brands, whatever you might have. Some of them are incredibly famous. Some brands are just that local place down the street that people really love. That aspect's not important. These are generally businesses, but sometimes organizations, nonprofits, schools, things like that. What are brands? There's no one definition out there of brands. Sometimes I like to even tell students, look, well, I'm not going to test you on this, but we should get on the same page by what we mean by a brand. Some definitions that are out there, if you look on something like Wikipedia, it'll give you like a very technical definition of a brand, the name, term, design, symbol, or any other feature that identifies one seller's product distinct from those of other sellers. That is not a definition that I would normally use, but it does kind of help people get a sense for like what we're talking about here, right? What it really does is it lists some of the ingredients of brands. Another definition that comes from the 22 Immutable Laws of Branding, a great book that sometimes I share with students. A brand is a singular concept or idea owned inside the mind of the prospect. That actually is one that I like and that I will come back and revisit in just a little bit. One of the most common definitions I see of brands out there is that a brand is a promise. It is a promise to your customer of some sort of level of quality or experience or expectation. It's that idea that if I were to spend some money on this brand, I kind of expect what I'm going to get. If I walk into a McDonald's anywhere, I'm not saying it's the best restaurant. I'm not saying it's the fastest restaurant. I just have a sense for what it is I'm going to get when I go there. And if they meet those expectations, typically I'm satisfied. All right, now when we talk about brands, normally we need to talk about things like case studies. Let's give examples of brands that are out there. Different brands have different elements to them, how they present themselves to the world. You take something like Southwest Airlines, that's just one random example of a brand. That's a business, right? It's an airline. They have thousands of employees. They have a number of planes. They have a number of hubs. They have aspects of like how they make money, how they spend money, expenses, operations, all those types of things. Those are parts of their business. When we talk about their brand, it's normally like, what do people think of when they think of Southwest? If they are about to go book a flight somewhere, where does that register in their minds? Are they known as the cheap one? Are they known as the friendly one? Are they known as the one with the most luxury? Typically something like Southwest, they're very big on customer service and they want to come off as the airline that cares. They have some tangible ways that they've tried to do this, although they've recently changed some of their practices. They also have some intangible ways of doing this, like say advertising that focuses on their employees or some different customer benefits they might have. One important thing, and we will revisit this later on, sometimes when people talk about brands, what they really mean is logos. And just know that a logo is very much a part of a brand system, but a logo is not a brand. The logo is just the most outward-facing face of a business many times. It's the part of the brand that people think of in their minds. If I was to ask my mom what's a brand, she would point to a logo. But many of you know, and also I'll get into more later on today, how much more a brand is. Really, I think of a logo as that tip of the iceberg. That's the part that you see. So, when you see something like the Golden Arches, you have a certain image in your mind. It has a certain reputation. It might instill a certain feeling in you. But that's not the logo that you're responding to. It's all the life experience you have with this brand that backs it up. All right. There's going to be a few times today that I'll touch on something just for a moment, but I know from my experience that there might be a lot of questions, and also I know that there's a lot more information I can share. Along the way, you'll see sometimes I'll include in these slides different places you can go to Blue Green Branding's website, bluegreenbranding.com. We have a resources page that has all kinds of tools, templates, and articles. First one I'm going to mention today is this business versus brand. What's the difference? This was something that we wrote up just because we knew that there was a lot of confusion about, are they the same thing? And the idea is that they're not the same thing, but they should be very, very close. I've seen some people define as a brand as like the soul of the business, the image of the business, the reputation of the business. They should be inseparable, but they tend to look at different things. Didn't know if there were any questions so far, really just kind of getting on the same page on some terminology. All right. So then just to kind of go a little bit further here, we live in a world not just of brands, but of choice. We're in a world where there are more brands than ever before. There's more choice that as consumers we can tap into at any given moment. I sometimes like to show the proverbial cereal aisle, or sometimes I'll show the proverbial convenience store refrigerator. The idea that in almost any category you can imagine, there are a good number of choices you might have in a particular brand that you can buy from. That might mean tangible products. It might also mean services, different tech providers, even like the brands that we're not spending money on, but that we just choose to spend time with, like which social media channels, for example, what mass media channels we might be checking out. And that's important because that's great news for us as consumers. To just have choice means that you're more likely to maybe get something that you exactly want. Sometimes that also helps drive costs down or innovation up, depends on the category. Sometimes it's also then difficult to navigate. If you back in the day only had the corner general store and you needed a new pair of shoes, well, that's where you're going to go to get your shoes. You don't really have any other choices. But now that you can pick up your phone and order from thousands of different vendors, it's not always easy to know which one should I go with. And from the brand side of things, businesses know that you have lots of choice. They want to be the one that you choose. They know that everybody's kind of got a short list in their heads of different brands and options in any particular category, and they want to be number one in your list, or at least somewhere in the consideration set. So in this world where there's all this choice, we all kind of have to find each other. We try to have to find, brands have to find their users and vice versa. And as a result, brands have to stand out to succeed. It is not enough to just know that there's something special about us. We're a hidden gem. We just got to get the word out. We know that we're unique, but we can't quite put our finger on it. That's not quite going to cut it anymore. That would be fine if all you needed to be successful was to be the closest option, in terms of geography. But now that people can choose from just about anywhere, brands have to find a way to know what they stand for, have something simple and powerful and compelling that people think of when they think of them, and then they have to get that out there. Because then when somebody's trying to think of any particular choice, like say, where do I want to get coffee here in town, we're not always thinking about, I wonder out of the 15 different options, which one was the exact combination of whatever. No. Typically, we have in our mind kind of like a quick thought about each place. I might go to Starbucks if I'm in the mood for a really custom drink. For my students, there might be a particular one on campus. Oh, that's a great place to get some work done or to study. Maybe it's more about cost. Maybe it's more about the environment. Lots of these different places know they can't just be the generic option. They've got to have something that they're specially known for. They have to be really good at delivering on it. There's this book out there called The Brand Gap, which I really enjoy. It's a short book. I encourage it. It's pretty inexpensive. It's like one of those airport books that you can buy it at the airport store and you can read it by the time you land. And in that book, there's this great line that says, your brand is not what you say it is, it's what they say it is. And that's the gap that he refers to in basically the name of the book. The idea of how do you close that gap? How do you connect with somebody of what you want your brand to be known for, and your customer, how you get that inside their minds. If you've ever seen the movie Inception, how do you actually plant something in somebody's mind to make them think about you the way that you want? But that whole idea, I think, is really true. There are a lot of brands out there that say, well, we're the one that's known for innovation and yada, yada. And it's like, are you really? Or is that just what you say you're known for? If we ask your customers, if we ask the public that that's what you're known for, is that actually what they would say, or would they say something else? There's definitely a gap in many cases. Here's an old cartoon I saw back in the day that talks about what is, how to explain the difference between selling, advertising, public relations, and branding. You see here under selling, there's this guy saying, I'm a great lover. In advertising, he just says it over and over again. Public relations gets somebody else to say it. And then the one on branding, this always stood out to me, is your customer or the person that you're speaking to coming to you saying, I understand you're a great lover. It's that idea of if you do this well, you don't have to just keep sending messages out constantly. You are already establishing yourself in the mind of your customer. And then they actually start to become some of your best salespeople. That is a difficult thing to achieve, but that is something of the holy grail when it comes to reaching out as brands. Okay, so just to kind of transition to this next part then, how do you get people to think the way you want about your brand? I mean, if it's not what you say it is, it's what they say it is, then how do you actually get them to say that's what it's for? That's what I'm going to get into next, and it involves a lot of defining different aspects of your brand for yourself, and then trying to find a way to actually get that out there back in front of people. All right, so let's talk a little bit about brand strategy and in particular what goes into it. Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of jargon out there for brand strategy. I think as a brand strategist, I can say we're some of the worst spreaders of jargon out there. In fact, there are times I've been at conferences where I've been the one who raises my hand saying like, so what's the difference between, a unique selling proposition and a differentiator? And the fact is that lots of times there's just different terms for the same thing. So I want to try to get into this in as streamlined a way as possible. And then I'll actually circle back to some of these things and explain how you can actually figure out what this might be for you. One of the places I like to start is brand architecture. Brand architecture is that framework that describes the relationship of a company's, their overall company name with their various products and services and other things that they offer. Sometimes once people take a look at a graphic like this, they just kind of instantly get it. Something like Apple has a very master brand approach, that idea of let's make our corporate identity the front and center, and then everything else is just a quick descriptive name off of it. Other brands, something like Amazon, for example, might have a whole collection of brands under it. Sometimes Amazon is front and center. Other times things like Whole Foods are allowed to just kind of be on their own. There's lots of ways to do this. This is an important thing to just think about early on, even for a small business. Because there's a lot of times that a small business already has their company brand, but then they might have a few products or services or offerings, and they think about things like, oh, do I need to launch a new product? Or do we already have this covered by what we offer now? What should I name my new product? Should my new product have a similar logo or a different logo or no logo at all? Before you think about any of those types of things, it's just helpful in your mind to organize the different properties that you might have and how they fit together. There's a lot that goes into these things. There are tools that we have to kind of define what's the right brand architecture for you. The brands I'm showing here, this is one extreme. This is the opposite extreme of the Apple example. This is like what's known as a house of brands. The idea that sometimes the company brand is not front and center. It's the product brands that shine through, but somehow they need to collectively fit as a set. So lots of ways that people go into this. Definitely things you want to think about before you start spinning off new products and offerings. There's a lot of times my consultancy is hired to clean up people's messes, because for years they have been launching new things just kind of like, hey, this will be fun. And then 5 years later, they're like, uh-oh, we've got kind of a branding architecture problem. All right, brand positioning. This is really gets to the heart of what I showed earlier when you're peering inside somebody's mind and talking about your brand's not what you say it is, it's what they say it is. Brand positioning is essentially saying, this is what they say it is. This is that place that the brand occupies in the mind of the consumer. And in particular, it's how they think of your brand relative to competitors. It's not enough to just be like, oh, they're cool, they're interesting, they're smart, they're well made. It's also like, they're the cheap one, they're the fast one, they're the friendly one, things like that. They're thinking of you relative to their other options that are out there. Brand positioning is, there's a lot of different tools that are used to define these. In fact, I consider brand positioning so core to brand strategy that sometimes I say this is the brand strategy within brand strategy. But one thing that's important, whatever tools you use, whatever effort you put in to make sure that your brand has a solid position, really it needs to be something you can summarize in a single sentence. That's a lot of what branding is. You have to try to boil things down to their purest form, just trim away all the fat. There's a lot of templates for these kinds of things. This is the most common one out there. I just like to share it because often people are like, how do I do this? A lot of times it's Mad Libs. It's a lot of times it's just like, look, if you know what your target audience is, you know the category you're in, and you know that one thing that you want to be known for, you just kind of plug them in and then you've got it. These are the kinds of tools, these templates are usually not seen by regular people. These are those behind the scenes types of things that brand strategists use. So for example, down here on the left, for people who don't want to overspend on shaving, Dollar Shave Club's the razor that gives you just the blades you need at the best price. Or over there, for upper middle class parents who drive to work, Volvo is the car brand that ranks #1 in safety. So again, this is not like advertising copy. This doesn't appear on their website, but this is what people think about if they are going to make content, innovate that next thing, try to create some company culture. They look to things like this to think about what one thing do we want our brand to be known for. There's other aspects of brand strategy, though, that are not as scientific and let's define exactly using the tools what we want to say. Sometimes it is a little bit more off of vibes. So brand persona, sometimes also known as brand personality, that's less about what is your brand all about. It's more about how do you communicate, right? What's the personality that you put out there? This is the type of thing that, a lot of times especially for a small business, is the kind of thing that, sometimes just the founder owner or just a small core team, sometimes working with a professional, can define this sort of a thing. But what it ends up doing is it defines the tone of voice you put out there with your communications, and sometimes it guides other company actions. Sometimes there are brands that are like, hey, we want to really come off as a funny one, or we want to come off as very intellectual. Maybe it's more about being nurturing and caring. These kinds of things matter because if you're communicating a lot, you don't want to come off as a split personality or even not having any personality at all. You want to be consistent with how you're putting yourself out there. Again, just like with some of the other things like architecture and positioning, I'll later on show some tools that are used for brand persona and how people define these things. There's some industry standard things like that color wheel I'll also talk about later on. There's other practices, like sometimes I've been in meetings with a C-suite for multi-billion-dollar companies, and we're cutting things out of magazines or talking about our favorite movies and TV shows, because that's a shorthand for figuring out what is the personality of this brand. Oh, it's like that one character from that one movie, and as long as everyone's seen the movie and knows what they're talking about, great, we can put down a few adjectives, we can define what this is all about. Positioning and persona, those two things go hand in hand when you're saying, what should we focus on and how do we put ourselves out there? Those are the elements that then come together later on for things like brand identity, marketing, advertising, all those types of things. There's also other aspects of brand strategy that sometimes are even less tangible than that. Sometimes there's what's known as your brand's why, meaning things like your mission and your values. Now, people sometimes feel differently about this sort of a thing. That guy on the right there, that's Simon Sinek. He's a brand strategy guy. About 20 years ago or so, he had some famous TED Talk where he talked about, was it 20 years? Wow. He had some TED Talk where he talked about how you should start with why. Your brand, your messaging, your brand should all be built around your purpose, your mission, why you get up in the morning, why you exist. The way he put it was, people don't buy what you make or how you make it, but why you make it. I would throw an asterisk on that and say sometimes. At the time, the pendulum was in the industry was always swinging one way or the other, and all of a sudden, companies were falling all over themselves to take things like their mission statement, which used to just be like in employee handbooks or buried somewhere in their web pages, and they started to bring it front and center. For some brands, that works out really well for them. Some brands really are mission driven. For other brands, it was like, you know what? You sell the cheapest widgets out there and you do really good at it, so maybe we don't have to lead with this stuff front and center. Just a little bit of that jargon I was talking about, mission and purpose. If you hear those two words, I've asked people about this for years. They're the same thing. I know there's some people that have little nuanced differences, but in both cases, they're your why. It's sort of like what drives people, what motivates people, and I've seen that impact things like who we choose to hire, or even why our company chooses to support this nonprofit. There's also things like values. This is typically a list of maybe like 4 to 7 characteristics. These are usually the what our brand stands for. Sometimes these come off as behavioral guidelines. Again, I have examples in just a little bit. Trying to take things a little bit further than a high-level mission statement and get into kind of how we actually act. To show that we have a moral compass. These are things that are related to positioning and persona. They're not quite the same thing. I would say that there are certain situations where they overlap quite a bit. I think I've got Patagonia here on the next slide. This is a good example of a brand that's very mission-led. They are all about their environmental causes, and from what I understand, that runs really deep. The founding of the company, there's a story, the CEO went on a trip to Patagonia on the southern tip of South America, was inspired by the environment, and then launched this company which sells clothing and outdoor goods, outdoor gear. But it's all about making it out of environmentally friendly materials, and then also having company practices like trying to reduce waste and giving back to causes around the environment. This is a very mission-driven company. Not every company leads with their mission like this. For a brand like Patagonia, just to go back a moment, that is the kind of thing where their mission and their positioning might be one and the same. For most brands, they're kind of separate. I could be the fastest this and also be very moral over here. Most importantly, if you actually want to define the why of your company, your mission and values, you just got to make sure you back it up with action. I don't believe that every single company needs to have these things. I think that most do, but I think that sometimes the worst offenders are people that put something down because they feel like they need something and then they move on with their lives and never look at it again. You don't want that kind of stuff to be front and center with your communications if you don't actually plan to back it up. Otherwise, people might call you out for that. Just to kind of give some other examples, sometimes people wonder with mission statements, this is going to be challenging, by the way. Right now, I'm working with a department at the University of Illinois trying to hone in on their mission statements. And it's tough because people have different definitions of what a mission statement should be. For example, sometimes people say, yeah, well, that's good for a sentence, but we should get into more about how we do it. I'm a purist. I'm somebody who feels like the true mission statement is that first sentence that captures the highest level. If you want to get into the how we do it later on, that's fine. Other people are like, hey, our mission is not very differentiated from other people. I don't actually believe that a mission has to be differentiated from other people. It just has to be true to yourself. So yeah, there's all kinds of different ones out there. Just as a few examples, for Google, their mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. That's what they say drives them. That's been their mission statement for quite a while now. For a company like Zappos, it's to provide the best customer service possible. They got famous for this because they sell shoes online, right? That's what they're known for. But they've always said that's not what drives us. What drives us is giving the best customer service possible. And there's all kinds of stories out there of somebody like calling their customer service line asking for help, with getting a refund on their shoes or something. And next thing you know, they're asking the customer service rep for advice on like the best pizza in this town or whatever it is. And they'll help because that's very much what they're about. So that's just a good example of like lots of times your mission statement is very closely tied to what work you do. And sometimes it's just, this is what motivates us. Values, I'd mentioned those earlier. These are usually a list of different, sometimes people call them guiding principles. There's all kinds of different jargon that's out there for there. But they're the kinds of things you stand for, core beliefs. There's another one. They're usually closely tied with your mission, but they're not one and the same. For example, here's some for Coca-Cola. You've got like leadership, collaboration, integrity, accountability. This is a very generic list of values, by the way. I see these all the time. But these are the kinds of things that have meaning to them. These are the kinds of things that if you're an employee at Coca-Cola, I guarantee that you get somewhere in that employee experience this list of values and also an explanation of how we bring this to life in our day-to-day lives. The best companies actually reinforce this with real things. If you're saying that these things are important to us, well, then how come the top sales rep every month is always the one who gets extra bonuses, even though they're a total jerk? Is there some sort of a misalignment going on right now between the values you say you stand for and the way that you recognize and incentivize people? So really good companies find a way to bring those things together. You want to incentivize people to actually help the company be profitable and grow, but you also want to make sure that they exemplify the sort of values that we have. Here's another one. This is for Virgin, which has a whole bunch of different industries that they play in. Things just like the best quality, must be innovative, must be good value for money. Sometimes these things are very cold and straightforward. But again, to these companies, to the people that work there, they have real meaning. And in the best companies, they actually drive their behaviors to the point that I like to actually say, my partner and I, when we do values exercises with people, we say, how are your values painful? Your values should hurt a little bit. Anybody can say like integrity, we don't lie and cheat and steal. Good for you. You are now just a baseline member of society. But if you're saying something like, the best quality, and you come into a situation where you're in product development and you made something that's a little bit subpar, but it's a lot less expensive to make, you should actually look at this as a litmus test and say, are we adhering to our values by actually, releasing this product, or should we reevaluate what we have going on here? So, values are the kinds of things that as you develop them, they should sometimes be done collaboratively. The best cases, they're done with leadership, but then also people at all levels of the organization. And then again, they're backed up with real action. All right, I know I'm rattling off a lot of different terms here. Brand identity tends to be the kind of thing that people are the most familiar with. So a lot of the things I've talked about so far are fairly behind the scenes in many cases. These are things that are front and center, right? So brand identity is usually referring to the cluster of things like your name, your logo, sometimes to a lesser extent your tagline or slogan, but basically the core ways that your brand shows itself to other people. These things work best as a set. And I'm here to tell you that they are generally comprised of brand positioning and brand persona mashed together. The idea is like we are trying to communicate what this brand is known for and also try to show its personality come through a little bit. Sometimes that comes through really clearly in the brand name even. Other times, the brand name is just, that's what somebody named it 80 years ago. But now by having this, identity, we're trying to make people feel a different way. For example, Nike is one of the most famous brands out there. It's one of the brands I like to use as an example because the name, the logo, and the tagline are all famous. They're all well known, and they all fit really well as a set. Lots of times I'll ask my students, do you know where the name Nike came from? I don't know. Do any of you guys know what Nike means?
Victory.
Victory, that's right. The Greek goddess of victory, right? Because they knew even when they were founded, they didn't just want to be known for running shoes or basketball equipment. They knew that they wanted to stand for something bigger than that. They had a vision for where they could go with this. And I guarantee you that like today, if this brand was emerging, some committee would shoot that name down. They would be like, no, nobody's going to know the Greek goddess of victory. No one's going to know how to pronounce this thing. Is it Nike? But no, they knew then we want our brand to stand for winning. And that also, like the logo itself, it has motion to it, but also it has an aspirational thing, right? It kind of goes up and it swishes back up and forward. The tagline of just do it is also meant to fit in with that. You're meant to push people to be their best. It's not just about winning against the other side. It's about improving yourself and being as competitive as you can be. Once you have something like a brand identity, which again, I'll talk about later on, some ways these things come together. Once you have that, it gets applied to just about everything. So people really want to make sure they take the time to get this kind of a thing right. But it's not enough to just be like, okay, hey, my nephew does logo designs, or even I'm just going to hop in AI right now and make something real quick. I'll talk about some of those tools later on. But you need to know what you stand for. You want to make sure that you're getting across, we want people to think of us for this one thing, and we want this personality to come through. Things like logos and identity are often such a big topic of interest. I didn't know if there were any questions or thoughts on that. Okay.
I mean, it's a great logo and it's a great name.
It is.
Personally, yeah.
Yep. And a lot of times I've worked with small businesses that the way that they've engaged us was, hey, I've got a trade show coming up in a month and I'm going to need some business cards. So can you real quick help me brand this company that I'm starting, which we just like to refer to as the tail wagging the dog. While it's great to hit those major moments where you can have an impact and hand out a new business card at a trade show, you don't want to rush that kind of a thing. That's when people end up creating something out of thin air just to kind of get by. And then again, lots of times my consultancy is hired to fix past mistakes. It's like, oh, you know what? That got us through our first year, but now we need something that's more long-term. So you think about these foundational things as you start, then you don't have to redo them later. Yeah, just some other brands that are out there that I think do a really good job. I mean, Tesla, there's another one that by now it's incredibly mainstream, but I remember when I was first touting this brand years ago, I'm like, it's a car brand, but they named themselves after a scientist from 100 years ago because they knew they're not a car brand, they're an electricity and energy brand because they knew even then that they were going to branch out. Plus, it's a cool name. Also, Google, anybody know where the name Google comes from? It's a very big number, that's right. The Googleplex is a number that is a 1 followed by 100 zeros. It's spelled a little bit different. They just kind of made it that way so they could own it. As I understand it, their headquarters in California is called the Googleplex. So how about Starbucks? Any thoughts on where Starbucks come from? No?
I mean, I don't know, Starbucks, a literary character. Yeah.
It is a literary character. You're right.
That's where it comes from.
That's where it comes from Moby Dick, which is one of those English class books I never read, but I really should have. Yeah, why would they name there's a character named Starbuck. Why would they name a coffee company after a character from a literary book? Well, because coffee is one of those old world commodities that they're based in Seattle and they want to elicit an image of, ships coming from the far away, bringing goods, things that are exotic that then can be spread around, so they want that kind of an image. It's also why my kids will say, how come they have a mermaid as a logo? And I say, oh, that's not a mermaid, that's a siren. That's like an evil mermaid that traps sailors. It looked a lot freakier in its original version, by the way. So if you ever want to see the first Starbucks logo, just prepare yourself. Anyway, there's other times where it's like, it's not always some high thought of, this obscure reference. Sometimes you have brand names like, I can't believe it's not butter. That is a full sentence with an exclamation mark as a name. But that's because they knew we want to make sure that our product is instantly known as a butter substitute that is so close to butter you can't believe it. So let's just put it right there in the name. We don't need to find the Norse god of butter or whatever is out there. Anyway, I can go on and on. I do a lot of naming in my field. It's a lot of fun. All right. Now, I just rattled off a bunch of different elements that are commonly found in brands. In a lot of cases, people sometimes they say, okay, that's great, but how do I know what's the right one for me? I have one right now. How do I know that it's good? Or if I should change it? Or maybe I'm starting something from scratch. So how do I actually figure out, that brand positioning or persona and all those types of things? So I kind of want to share with you a few tools that are commonly used. Some of them are even like tools that my partner and I modified and customized to different scenarios that we worked in. In some cases, I may not go in detail, but I'm happy later on if anybody wants to circle back to any of these to show you how they work. For starters, it's just really important to note that brand strategy is built on research. We do not start by just sitting in a room and spitballing ideas. We start by learning as much as we can about some key areas of our business. Target audience research, and I'm going to talk about all these in a little more detail in a moment. But target audience research is, I would say, a first among equals. Target audience research is so important that I would actually say it's almost more important than what you do is who you're selling to. Things like your own brand and understanding your strengths and weaknesses, that's important as well. Obviously, this is actually an area where people don't usually need to be told this. If somebody's a small business owner, they know their brand inside and out. In fact, if anything, they need to be reminded to not always lead with what you do, but who you're selling to. However, sometimes they tend to overlook their weaknesses or overestimate their strengths because those are things that are relative. And that's why it's important to also look at your competitive landscape. Most business owners I know don't really have a great grasp on their competitive set. They might know the names of a couple of competitors they're always up against or lose business to, but they tend to not really know how those companies also position themselves because, again, it's all relative. Your strengths and weaknesses, it all depends on how much your audience cares and what else other options they have out there. When you do research on these different areas, you're looking for certain patterns, and I'll call out some of these and some of the tools of how you figure this out. You're looking where areas overlap, like, hey, that thing that our target audience really cares about, we deliver on that really well. There's a nice connection right there. Sometimes you're also looking for gaps. Hey, that thing that our target audience really wants, none of our competitors are really talking about that right now. Maybe there's an opportunity over there. Overall, though, what you're trying to do is figure out, where do you win? Where are the areas that you have something that your customer wants, and if you can just get it in front of them in the right way, they will go for it. And then also, where are ways that you win against your competitors, where it's like, this is a message that we can focus on because we're stronger at it than our competitors are, and we can back them up. This right here is just a photo of a wall during my agency days when we were doing research. It looks like a big old mess, but there's actually like a rhyme and reason to this kind of thing. And even though a lot of these things are done digitally now, there's a lot of value in seeing them physically all together so you can recognize patterns. That's why a lot of software, like collaboration platforms right now, are patterned after this feeling. There's a lot of that collaboration software that makes this look like a Post-it note and that look like a string. It's because they're trying to simulate that kind of experience. I mentioned this earlier on, but I tell students this all the time. Who you're selling to is more important than what you're selling. When it comes to defining your brand, you need to really understand the mindset of the person you're trying to reach. I even tell people, we're not in the advertising or branding business, we're in the persuasion business. And if you want to persuade someone, you have to know as much as possible about them and what makes them tick. There's a lot of different ways that people look at target audience, and I might be telling you things you already know, but just some of the ways we like to package this up when we're doing brand strategy. One thing to keep in mind is your target audience is not your entire audience. I think a lot of small businesses, really all businesses, they think of their target audience as, who would I accept money from? Which of course is everyone, right? So lots and lots of brands out there start by saying, we're for everybody, which no, you're not. There's no brand out there that's for everybody. Even if they would be enjoyed by lots of people, they still should be narrowing their focus. They should have a type of person in mind when they're doing their communications. We tend to break this down by primary target audience, like these are the main people we're focused on now, and we kind of narrow things in a little bit. And then there's sometimes secondary audiences. Sometimes there might be one, sometimes there's two or three. It's sort of like, these are other groups of people that we care about. We're just not as focused on them right now. And then some of the ways that we define target audiences. Often we use terms like demographics and psychographics, which again, probably familiar with, but just to kind of separate them out. With demographics, we're talking about characteristics of the person, the kinds of things you can check off, like on a census. They're this age, education level, occupation, location, things like that. Psychographics, though, they tend to be a lot more important. That's more like getting inside the mind of the person and saying, what are they like? What do they like? What is their personality? What are brands that they purchase? What are their interests? This is when I say what makes people tick, this is what I'm referring to. It's important that you have both demographics and psychographics because together, often with just a few bullet points, you can kind of summarize the type of person you're going for. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, most of my focus in my career has been in business to business. There are demographics and psychographics of businesses as well. A lot of times you're like, hey, are we going for big enterprise-like customers? Or are we talking to small businesses as our customers? What is the title, the job title of the person that we're trying to reach? Is this an organization that tends to be focused on mitigating risk? Or is this more an organization that's trying to do rapid growth? These are all the types of things we consider when we are trying to market to them. How do we learn about them? This is a whole broad topic that we can discuss later on if you like. You may have your own ways of researching your target audience. My personal favorite, especially for small businesses, is this first bullet up here. Just that primary research of let's go talk to the people who are in our target audience. That can include customers that you have currently. You can interview them or do focus groups or surveys to learn how they feel about you and the types of things that they care about. Sometimes it's more about talking to people that are not your current customers, but they meet the profile of the demographics and psychographics you're looking for. This is a way of getting to somebody who you haven't yet swayed in any way to just try to get their unadulterated opinions. Sometimes it's even, I encourage if you can, try to get a hold of the customer that got away. Maybe depending on the nature of your business, there's somebody who almost went with you, but they chose somebody else later on. Well, often we never hear from those people again. But if you ever have an opportunity, try to find out why. That can actually be hugely valuable. So yeah, things like interviews, focus groups, surveys, hugely valuable. Other things though, sometimes people actually go on social media or just listen in on how people are talking about things and acting.
Reddit's a really good source.
Reddit is fantastic, that's right. I'm a fan of Reddit just as a consumer. Yeah. Reddit is also the #1 source of AI content. Draws from Reddit, so that's often considered like the unofficial forum of the internet in some different ways. But yeah, you can find out a lot about how people feel about, if not just your company, like your overall category by going on that. Sometimes there's a lot of articles and blogs and things that already exist. Somebody else has already done the research for you, so may as well find out what's out there. There's also sometimes different databases you can plug into. There's different organizations that create, of course, for sale, profiles on different audiences. There's a lot of different options.
We actually have access here at the library to Simmons and to the Claritas Prism stuff.
Oh, that's great.
Which I think is really fascinating.
Well, I know that a lot of clients don't have access to that, especially smaller businesses. And then students of mine sometimes can access it through university sources, but then they lose that once they graduate. So
send people here to the
there you go. Those are really valuable. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, MRI. I forget what it stands for. It's just another one of those databases that you can learn about information of tell me how many people in these zip codes and this income level and this age group also cross over with this and that. You get certain data sets and you kind of cross over. So there's a lot of public data that's out there. Some of the clients that I work with today are in the space of technology and data. It's fair to say that all your data is out there. We have been, as a society, willingly been giving it away for some time now. So just assume that anything you could possibly know about anybody is out there. And then some people have the ability to aggregate this information and then give you the tools to search it. So yes. It kind of is horrifying. I feel like we're almost over the hump of it's horrifying to okay, now we're into acceptance, but what can we get out of this? Yep. By the way, I'm going to mention AI just a couple of times because obviously it's the hot topic of the past couple of years and is not going anywhere. AI can be a great complementary resource for this. There have been times, for example, that I'm like, oh, my client is starting a chain of cosmetic surgery and Botox places on the East Coast. And we've already defined our target audience is, women who are 35 to 45-year-olds at this income level and these psychographics. Let's make sure that we talk to them, but then also we can supplement that by opening up an AI agent and saying, hi, I'm a 38-year-old woman who lives in New Jersey and da-da-da-da-da. What are my favorite brands for this? How do I feel about that? What are some of my concerns? Whenever we use AI, I always say it's a good complementary source because it might also give you stuff that's nonsense and you can't just take at face value. But it's a nice compliment to hey, I just interviewed 8 people and then I forgot to ask them this question, but it's the kind of thing that I can kind of fill in the gaps. All right. Now, in addition to target audience research, I mentioned you also want to really understand your own brand. Now, for a lot of business owners, this is the easiest form of research to do, but it's still worth taking the time to do it and put these things down. Lots of different terms out here as well, I know. Features and benefits, these are the types of things that what are a couple of things, products that you sell or things that you do, and then what does your audience get out of that? So for example, if one of your features is, our widgets are made out of this kind of alloy, which is 25% lighter. Okay, that's interesting. So what? The benefit of that is okay, so your target audience can get the strength and durability they need, but without adding the weight, so it's more portable. So a lot of times what business owners have to be reminded is think about what you do, but then put it through the filter of what does my audience get out of that? They tend to just be a bulleted list of different things. So values we've already talked about, but sometimes that comes back into these things. This is for if your brand already exists, not if it's a brand new company, but you've already kind of been established for a bit. I do a lot of rebranding in my career. And then sometimes you're looking at other brand assets, like what else we got? We have that one founder that has that amazing story or maybe is famous for something else. Sometimes it's like we have this special packaging that is iconic. We have this particular network we can tap into that nobody else can. It's worth kind of, the whole audit idea is collect everything in one place that might have any value at all. Some of the types of questions that you ask yourself as you're collecting all this stuff is like, where is my brand really strong? What are things we're good at? Where are we weak? It's actually good to acknowledge and know what your weaknesses are. Not saying that you're going to lead with that in your messaging, but you should at least be aware what they are. In particular, ask, how do I make our customers' lives better? This is why I say out of all these things, benefits tend to be the most important, because they're the things that are like, in what ways is this beneficial to my user? Also questions like, do you have a differentiator? Sometimes when listing off features and benefits, it's worth noting, oh, is that one something that nobody else does? Are we the best at that? Are we the only at that? Are we the first at that? Sometimes it's not one killer differentiator. I would love to say that every brand has that one thing that makes them distinct. Most of them don't. Sometimes you've got to kind of figure it out of like, okay, maybe if we don't have one thing that makes us special, maybe there's a unique combination of a couple of other features and benefits. Like, you know what, we are the fastest brand that's also eco-friendly in this category, something like that. So you can still become the only by kind of triangulating a little bit. But it's really like, first you collect all this information so you can start to know what you're playing with. And I'll show you some tools you can use later on. You also want to make sure this third part of the research stool, I talked about target audience, brand audit, and now your competitive landscape. This is where most businesses fall way short. This is where a lot of times we'll ask our clients about who are your competitors, and they struggle to name more than a couple. They especially struggle to think about how they compare to the offerings of their competitors, and in particular, how they're messaging and communicating themselves relative to their competitors. So while it's admirable to be focused on your target audience, you should also know what other options does our audience have. There's a really good chance that something that you do is also something that they can get from somewhere else. When we're talking about market landscape, a lot of times this is like, there's market reports you can find online. Sometimes they cost money, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you already have this information. If somebody's created a business plan, a lot of times they already have this. But it's kind of worth knowing, like, what is the overall shape of our industry and where is it headed? These are those kind of macro effects that really come into play later on, because you are swimming in some kind of a stream. Then when it comes to competitors, this is where it's often more like, all right, so let's see, who are we typically up against? If you're a local coffee shop, you should know who the other coffee shops are out there. You should also be aware that lots of people might make coffee at home. Some people might drink tea instead of coffee. There's a lot of ways to look at competitors. If you're more of like a service-oriented business and you're trying to get clients in town, well, who else are we usually up against? If there's somebody who's needs our services, they might be shopping around and meeting with a few people. Is there a particular company out there that we often lose out to? Are we aware of who they are? Do we know why we lose to them? How do we compare to these competitors? If you can actually rattle off a name of like 3 to 5 different competitors, do we have a sense of like, are we all kind of the same? There's been a lot of industries I've worked in that are like, oh yeah, this industry has a big 3, right? There's so many industries out there that are completely unrelated, but somehow they've worked their way that there's 3 big brands at the top that make up the majority of the business in the industry. And lots of times they're all pretty much the same. They have to find kind of superficial ways to kind of position themselves against each other. Other times there's like one amazing company in this space and everybody's just trying to keep up. Amazing could just mean it's the biggest. Sometimes it's the most innovative. Is it the kind of thing where this is a crowded marketplace? We have kind of a commodity type product and we're always up against dozens and dozens of options? Or is it really like, there's like one big dog in town and we are always just trying to like nip off a little bit of business off of what they get? And then what do we actually know about our competitors? Is it the kind of stuff that you can do a little online research and learn quite a bit about your competitors? That's still pretty surface level. What do your customers think about them? This is also really important. This is where sometimes competitive research and customer research actually overlaps quite a bit. Like I mentioned, most small businesses don't actually know that much about competitors. This is not something to be ashamed of. This is just something that out of doing this many times, I find that this is a big blind spot that people have. It is really, really hard / impossible to really do brand strategy if you don't know what you're up against. Remember, you're trying to do brand positioning. You're trying to get inside the mind of your customer to be known for one thing relative to the competitive set. So you've got to know what is the competitive set I'm dealing with right here. An example is that like I've worked with a nonprofit before that in their space, they're like, you know what? We're great in that we have very little overhead for all donations that we get. We only need about 10% of that for our own employees, and the rest of the other 90% goes directly to people in need. That sounds really nice, right? Then we did some competitive research and we found out they're actually average to bad on that in their space. It turns out that 90-10 split is pretty common, and then a few of their competitors actually have more of like a 95-5 split or even a 100-0 split. Maybe we should know that before we start touting from the rooftops that this is what we're known for, right?
I think that's really true, though. I work with a lot of nonprofit startups.
Mhm.
They absolutely have no idea who's already out there doing the same thing or similar to. And
Yeah.
I'm like, why don't we start there? You know, like that's what I would start with.
Yeah.
You know, is this needed? Is already, you know, why are we replicating services? You know, so that's, yeah, but I agree. There's a lack of awareness oftentimes.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think the time that we first
Yeah.
met a couple of years ago
Yeah.
was you were working at a nonprofit that my
Yeah.
class was working with. So that
that's
came
right,
together.
Habitat, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, and by the way, there's on that front of nonprofits, I've had a lot of times. So my class, I taught the capstone course for advertising for years, and we always worked with local nonprofits. And when we would talk to nonprofits, we'd ask them, who are your competitors? And you know what the most common answer is? We don't have any competitors. We are friendly, we are nice, we are there to help people. They're misunderstanding what we mean by competitors. I don't mean someone trying to bring you down. I'm just saying, if you help starving dogs, there might be 5 other organizations in towns that help starving dogs. And if you're trying to all reach the same people for donations and volunteers, the pool is spread pretty thin. So we're not saying they're competitors like we want to take them down. We're saying like, be aware of what's out there. In fact, lots of times your competitors are also partners of yours. So it's just learning more about who's out there. Also, by the way, AI is great for researching competitors. In fact, lately, my partner for Blue Green Branding is an aficionado with competitive research. She does more thorough competitive research than anyone I've seen. And since AI showed up a couple of years ago, it's like on overdrive. It is the kind of tedious work that AI is fantastic for. You still have to apply your human brain and go back and make sure that it's not hallucinating and it's saying real things. But you can do a lot of competitive research in a short period of time. In fact, while you're at it, have it study your own brand as if you were a competitor and see how you stack up. Sometimes it can be really telling to learn, because it's just pulling from the surface, right? It's just grabbing from what the internet is saying, what you put on your website and your socials and Reddit or whatever. But that stuff does matter, and it's interesting to see how things show up. All right, just to kind of go through some of the tools that are out there. I had listed off earlier a bunch of different elements of brand strategy, like brand architecture, for example. You should know brand architecture is in itself a whole topic that, you know, if I'm teaching my class, I'm going to give you an hour on brand architecture. We're not going to do that today, but you should know brand architecture has certain frameworks that are out there. Lots of people like to start with something that's multiple choice before going custom. And just know that these are some common frameworks that are out there. The idea of like a master brand. Do you want the kind of brand where your company name and logo is front and center all the time? And as you're launching, say, new products and offerings, they all fit under that. We're always promoting our own company brand first and foremost. On the other extreme, you've got your standalone brand, or known as house of brands. That's like earlier on when I was showing you things like Kraft Heinz. Procter & Gamble is one of the best examples of this that's out there. You know, there are people out there that don't really know what Procter & Gamble is, and yet for many years they were the #1 spender on advertising in America for decades, right? How can that be that the #1 spender on advertising for decades, that people don't really know what they do? Well, because they promote their products. Because, you know, Charmin and Bounty and Duracell and Pampers, they are the products, they are the brands that they put out there. Procter & Gamble is almost just kind of like a holding company for those things. Then you have this endorsed brand, sub-brand approach, which is like a mix of those two types of things. So sometimes people are like, you know what, I want my company brand to be pretty prominent, but I still want each product line to kind of have its own little distinct identity. So as a result, I find a way to make like my company brand sort of an add-on or a shell for what else is out there, like Marriott in this case. So again, most companies and their offerings have some sort of a framework. Most small businesses don't think about this at all until they've already grown to the point that they've made a mess, and then they have to hire consultants like us to fix it. I'm trying to make it so you don't have to do that. Just be thoughtful about it as you're starting out. Very often the way this happens is that like out of nowhere, they come up with some new product and decide to give it its own brand name and logo, and then 2 years later, they're like, wait a second, why was that one special and not this one? But typically people kind of start with one of these, and then they kind of customize it for themselves. We have an entire tool on Blue Green Branding's resource page. We create those free resources for people, by the way, because the way we look at it is if you're a small business and what you need can be found here on our website, then you shouldn't hire us. Education is a big part of our brand, so more power to you. If you pull down some of these resources and it turns out that you can't quite do it yourself and you need some professional help, then yeah, go ahead and call us. But we're happy if people can handle it themselves. We have an entire DIY brand architecture guideline on there, so check that out if you're interested. I wanted to see though, anybody have any questions on brand architecture? This is one of those more abstract things that people don't usually think about.
Can you think of any like businesses locally who are kind of doing like a sub brands or like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think of like Brew Lab and Bake Lab,
Okay.
and they are obviously like related brands, but they have their own distinct personality in two different locations. That is different than something like Espresso Royale, which is one brand that might have different locations, but it's all under Espresso Royale. So, and like you can go even further than that. I'm just using coffee shops because it's an easy example, but like some of them will have their own distinct products that are branded in with that. So something like Brew Lab, they go with this kind of scientific look, right? Because it's a lab, and they kind of play that up sometimes with the different things that they offer. So yeah, just a good example. I can think of others though. I mean, there's like Triptych, which is the brewery, down south in Savoy. Love that place. They always have like fun names for their different product lines that are out there. That's very much in line with their brand persona. They're like, you know what? When we launch a new product, a different kind of beer, we're going to name it after some quote from a fun movie because that's what we do. It wouldn't make sense if out of nowhere they came up with a name that was very scientific or very hoity, right? Yeah. All right, one of the things I talked about earlier was brand positioning, that whole thing of like being known for one thing in the industry and trying to get that in the minds of your audiences. There's a lot of tools out there for positioning. I'll share a couple with you, mostly to say that when we do this for real, we tend to use multiple tools as we do it. The most common tool that I've seen out there for lots of types of strategy, including brand positioning, is a SWOT analysis. This is the most commonly known one. I like to tell people SWOT analyses are some of these like the easiest brand positioning tool to use. It's also the easiest brand tool to BS. If I have a student, that's doing a SWOT analysis, I don't know if they put thought into it or if they just did it on the way to class because all they got to do is fill 4 different buckets with a couple of bullet points. The fact is, though, it's a good way of kind of collecting your thoughts in one place. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Those generally pair up in different ways where strengths and weaknesses are considered internal things, like these are strengths and weaknesses about our offerings and our company. Opportunities and threats tend to be external things. Here are things happening out in the world that impact us potentially in positive and negative ways. So as a result, you have 2 internal, 2 external. You also have 2 positive, 2 negative strengths and weaknesses. So it's a nice way to kind of collect in one spot a bunch of important facts about your organization or things that impact it. The downside of a SWOT analysis, it doesn't really help you prioritize with anything. You might end up getting like a list of 5 different bullet points in your strengths or even more, and then you're like, so which one of these should I focus on? So I tend to think of a SWOT analysis as sort of like an early tool I might use to kind of lead to other things. You see there on the right, this is a competitive map. This is when people actually try to visually map out what their industry looks like with them versus their competitors. Generally, the way this works is you pick 2 different criteria. For example, in this case, they're looking at car brands. Price is the y-axis, where it's more expensive up top and less expensive down below. And then style is the other axis, more conservative on one end, sporty on the other. And you can see that then they plotted out these different brands that are in there. So you've got something like, luxury brands in the upper right corner. Then you get kind of like higher end, but kind of more classic type brands in the upper left. You get your more affordable everyday brands down low, right? This is just one way to slice it. If you want to do a map like this, first of all, why do people do this? They kind of get a sense for how they stack up against the competition. This is something that a SWOT analysis can teach you. It gives you a sense of like, if there's a couple of different criteria you think might be the things we want to focus on, great, let's map it out. Maybe we had determined, I used the example earlier, maybe speed and eco-friendliness for your industry are the 2 criteria you're thinking about. Cool, map it out. If you're saying you're good at that, you should end up in the upper right corner. But are there 5 other brands that are right there with you? Is there somebody that's actually further up than you are? Ooh, maybe we should switch things up. So this is just kind of a nice way to look especially at how you compare to competitors. The hard part with this one is, 2 hard parts. One is to determine what are those 2 axes. That completely changes the map every time you do it. So if I do a competitive map, I usually do it several times in a row, playing around with a few different criteria until we get a combination that there's a clear way that we win. It's also a nice way to uncover gaps. You might, by picking the right two criteria, there's an entire quadrant that's now open. That might mean that we've got some opportunity. And sometimes people use that for rebranding. The other challenging thing is that people don't always really know how they stack up against competitors, which is why something like this requires not just competitive research, but also a brand audit and also target audience research. We got to have all the information to kind of fill that in. Down here, this is a tool that actually I developed some years ago for clients because those two tools I just showed you and others that were out there weren't quite cutting what it is that we needed to do. We found that we were, pretty good at taking inventory of features and benefits, sometimes values for our clients, right? Just going back a slide, it's easy to take inventory of those things here, like in a SWOT analysis, but how do I know which one or two to focus on? And how do I know which ones to ignore? So this is a tool where actually I've done this with clients a lot of times, sometimes with Post-its and sometimes on screen. List off something like a dozen of those different features and benefits and values, and then plot them on this map. This map, we call it the 3x3. This measures how good are you compared to your competitors, that's the y-axis, and then how much does your target audience actually care? This is the kind of thing that businesses don't always think about, right? An example of that is, I'll explain in a moment what happens if you land in the wrong spots. But when you have those two axes, then you can take a look at each individual quality of your company, of your offering, of the benefits that you provide, and ask yourselves, okay, it says here that we only have 10% overhead and we give 90% to people in need. So low overhead or 10% overhead. How does that measure? Well, it turns out that that's actually something that we're just kind of average at. So on the y-axis, we're just somewhere around the middle. And then it turns out actually that it's something that our audience really, really cares about. So it's something that's all the way to the right. So what you do is when you evaluate these different types of points, there's some really great conversations that come out of this. A lot of times my job is to meet with the client. Usually there's a few people on the client side, right? There might be the business owner, maybe it's their leadership team, maybe there's a few employees just mixed in there as well. Some really rich conversations of like, okay, guys, we say that our products do this really well and our audience really cares. Then it turns out that the person who's here from research and development says, you know what, actually, we're not the best at that. We're kind of average at best. And then somebody from sales says, you know what, guys, it turns out our audience doesn't really care about that. And all of a sudden, the thing that the president thought was going to end up in the upper right corner ends up somewhere around the muddled middle. There's a lot of awkward, but also honest conversations that come out of these kinds of exercises. The whole reason for doing things like this, though, is to figure out where they land and what to do with it. So when you do an exercise like this and you have different points landing in different spots, you're doing that because the things that land in the upper right corner, these are things that your brand is really good at or even unique at compared to the competitors. That's why it's high up. And it's something that your audience really cares about. That's why it's off to the right, which means it now has the potential to be your main message, which means even like your brand positioning. If you remember that positioning statement Mad Libs template I showed earlier, that's the thing that appears in that, that all-important line at the bottom. This is what we should be known for, right? We have the fastest delivery and the best customer service in our industry. Bam, slam dunk. So there's a lot of ways we can figure this out. You just have to be honest with yourself. Lots of times, even if you emerge with a main message at the top, or sometimes at most two main messages at the top that you can merge together in a unique way, lots of times there's other points that appear in that light green perimeter. It doesn't mean that we ignore these things. It just means that we don't lead with them. But you know what? Sometimes it's like we also should mention the fact that we're affordable, and we should also mention the fact that we're a family-owned business, and maybe this third thing as well. Those are the kinds of things that, like on a website, they might not be the first thing up top, but you scroll down a little bit, and then they are. Also, you might notice these two red risk zones. This is just if something appears here, usually it means we have a problem and we need to do something about it. If something appears in the upper left, that means this is something that you're great or unique at, but your audience just does not care. That doesn't mean that you have to do anything about it, but you certainly shouldn't be leading with that message or else you're just screaming into the void. So typically when that kind of thing happens, businesses are like, you know what, I think we should have some communications and messages around why this matters. I think they just need some education. If we just educated our audience more on this, they would care more. It's basically a way of saying, let's try to get this thing to move further to the right. If something appears in the bottom right, it's an even bigger problem. That means that there's something your audience really cares about that you're pretty bad at compared to your competitors. We chuckle, but we all have aspects in our organizations like this. It's important you acknowledge it and then say, what do I do about this? The only way to move it up is to actually get better at it. I have had times that I have clients that hire us and they say, our audience really cares about customer service and we have the worst customer service in town. So how do we message around that? And the answer is messaging is not going to solve this problem. You should maybe take some of the money you were going to pay people like us and go back and fix some of the issues you have and then we'll talk about the right ways to message. So this kind of a tool, my background in writing and strategy has been really effective in figuring out like what messages should we put out there. Actually, I just want to pause there. Any questions on any of these tools? I know I'm flying through these pretty quickly, but hopefully there's maybe one or two in here that seem valuable. All right. Other examples of things. This is an example of a different type of message map. This is not like plotting things out. This is like once we've determined what our messages are, how do we actually create a little bit of structure around them so we're not just saying everything all at the same time. In fact, I have actually seen times that people are always trying to say everything at once, and that's when you end up with headlines that are just long run-on sentences. So there are times that, there's a client that I've worked with before. It's like, okay, we've determined what that one core message is. Let's put it, right up top, really big. This is just a behind the scenes document, but it means anybody working on advertising or marketing, they know that that key message needs to come across. And then, you know what? Lots of times there's what we call pillars. These are good support messages. Sometimes that top level message is only so valuable, but people, if you've piqued somebody's interest, it's like, okay, so now what? Or how do you do that? So a lot of times you can break it down. In this case, this is a product that helps convert more good applicants into customers. How does that work? Well, we can explain more about how you get more new customers. We can explain more about the best consumer experience, uncompromising protection, and long-term innovation, right? It's like, that's how they chose to break it down. They have further proof points and things like that. This is just a good way to structure things. But like I said, the most common thing I tell clients with messaging is you can say everything you want, you just can't say it all at the same time. All right, I mentioned earlier on brand persona. That's when you're just trying to figure out the personality of your brand. This is that archetype wheel. This is kind of a fun thing. This is like something that was innovated by Carl Jung, the psychologist, like a long, long time ago. He wasn't talking about brands at the time. He was trying to figure out like, hey, do all personality types of human beings fit on some kind of a wheel? Somewhere along the way, advertisers and branding people are like, hey, you know what? That kind of a thing could work for brands just as well as it could work for people. And so you'll see these like words around the perimeter there, around the circle, saying things like creator, innocent, sage, explorer. Basically, there's like a dozen different personality types. And they're like, hey, is one of these the closest to what you're going for with your brand? The idea that like, the Apple might be known as the creator because it's like we're known for innovation. Whereas Nike down there might be known as the hero because they're all about mastery. So again, this is not a scientific approach. In fact, typically this is just a starting point for a conversation when working with clients. Which of these appeals the most to you? I find that personally, this is only so helpful. It's kind of like a good starting point. I've also learned that these terms mean different things to different people, so it can be a little bit challenging. For example, the number of times a client has told us, yeah, our brand wants to be known for being funny, only for us to ask a group of 8 people on the client side, what does funny mean to you? They have 8 different definitions of funny. So it's important you kind of use this as a tool to get on the same page about things. You can find this online pretty easily. People love to use this kind of stuff. Personally, from my experience, this is a tool that's a little bit better. I actually do find it's helpful to sometimes find some shared pop culture references out there. Shared is the important word there. It only has value if everybody involved knows who we're talking about. But sometimes it's like, is there a character, whether that means a real person or fictional, living or dead, that best exemplifies what we're talking about here? Sometimes it also comes to life through a list of like 4 or 5 different adjectives, those personality traits, and then we kind of reverse engineer who's somebody that best exemplifies that. Sometimes it's also like, hey, in another industry, who would that be? Who's the car equivalent of what we're going for? Who's the restaurant equivalent or the tech platform equivalent of what we're aiming for? So that can be helpful as well. Just an important note, as you're doing this, you're not defining your spokesperson or your mascot. This is not an externally facing thing. This is an internally facing thing before copywriters and art directors and all those types of people start making a bunch of content for you. But yeah, this is why I end up like talking to C-suite people about movies we've seen recently. I've also seen times that like, the president of a company is like, I really like this one character from this one book, and all their employees nod along. They're like, brilliant observation. And then it turns out none of them have read the book and they're just agreeing with their boss. So again, this only works as sort of like a little shorthand with your people. You should know that some of the other elements I talked about, things like naming and logo design, these are normally pretty intensive processes that, like, yes, you can pick a name out of nowhere, but then there's also a legal search. Then there's also the matter of what does this mean to people? Is it communicating the message that you want? Got resources on Blue Green for you to check that out. This was a little cartoon version I made of it to kind of walk through a naming process. Most important though, you'll see the ingredients of naming are the things we've talked about here. Audience, architecture, positioning, persona. These are the things you use if you're like, now we're coming up with our name. Now we're coming up with our logo. Now we need to create some social media content. Now we're going to make a video. You think of those elements and you combine them to make these things. That's also why in this age of AI, it's nice to have these materials so that if you're using that tool, you can train AI on your stuff so that it gives you things that make sense for what you're coming up with. All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'd love to just kind of open it up to conversation, is let's say you want to build your own brand blueprint. What does that look like? How do you do that? That's really, the premise of this entire piece is how do you take these abstract, important elements of brands and make them tangible? How do you make them something that you can actually put together and use? This is just a real simplified version of those things I've listed out before. And in fact, a lot of times I encourage small businesses and startups, sometimes even bigger businesses or students, try to get your brand strategy down to one page. If you can get it on one page, it means you've kind of trimmed away the fat and we're focused on the most important stuff. Because your audience is going to give you a few seconds of their attention at best. So you yourself should be able to communicate this stuff pretty quickly. Things like, your brand name, if it already exists. Can you actually summarize your target audience in just a couple of bullet points? Do you have one primary, maybe a couple of secondary? Do we have a couple of demographics and psychographics we can put down and then move on, but like that really captures what they're about? Features and benefits about your own product and your own brands. Can you list off 3 to 5 key things that you do or key aspects about your company or your products? And then can you list off what they do for your target audience? That's how you translate features to benefits. If it turns out that a feature is not that special, you're not that good at it, leave it off. If it turns out that you can't really communicate what that does for people, maybe we should reevaluate how important this is. Then things like, can you list out a couple of key competitors and just really quickly speak to how you compare to them? Like, how do they relate to you in the mind of the consumer? If your customer has a short list in their heads and you're on it with them, which one are you? Where do you fit in? Things like brand architecture, which could be a whole guide, but can you summarize it, in just a sentence or two? We have a master brand approach with a couple of hero brands, blah, blah, blah. Can you capture your why? This is the kind of thing that I would say for some companies is optional and for others is the absolute front and center thing about their company. Do you have a one-sentence mission statement you could put down about what motivates and drives you? Can you list off 3 to 5 values of like what you stand for and guide your behaviors? Then we have that positioning and persona, both of which can generally be captured pretty quickly. That positioning statement is one sentence. It's good to just get that down. If you've got some support messages that you want to include, that's fine. Go ahead and put those separate from a positioning statement. And then something like brand persona, can you list off 3 to 5 characteristics of your brand as it relates to like your tone of voice and your personality before people start to make content? So that's what I would challenge all of you to do if you're able to do this. And like I said, on Blue Green Branding, there's a lot of resources for this. I'm not going to walk through this whole thing, but there's this template on here that you can just download called DIY Brand Blueprint. And this is like a PDF that's like 10 pages on there. You can walk through what it is, who uses it, some common things of like, the people that use these are people that speak for your brand, represent your brand, your salespeople. If your president is out there talking to the press, also people that create content for you. It's not a matter of just like, hey, we just hired that agency or we've got that intern. Do they have the kind of things they need to guide them? Other things of like what's covered in there, which I've already included, but then there's even more beyond that. We have examples in there of different personas and positionings and message maps and all that kind of stuff. And then even the creative expression of how it results in other things. And then even more lists of kind of like resources for if you need more help with like a template for interviews for customers or for employees or positioning workshops, all that stuff's in there too. So I'm just sharing this with you because we're going to share these slides afterwards and I just want you to have all of this information. All right. Well, at this point, I would love to just kind of open up and hear your thoughts. Any questions, anything on here you'd like to know more about or circle back to? Yeah.
I have a question about a scope of a business, especially a small business, whether it's a local business with a local audience or whether it's something that's going to be a small business with a nationwide business. Say somebody had like a Shopify website, a Wix business, selling eBay, Amazon. Is branding and advertising even a worthwhile effort on something that large of scale where you're such a small fish in a large sea?
I would say it's even more important there. I would say the bigger your competitive set and the bigger your customer base, the more important branding is. I'll be honest, there are sometimes small businesses that are entirely driven by the reputation and network of the individual who founded it. And branding can maybe not be as essential to them. But if you're putting yourself out there where there's a ton of competitors and you're a small fish, I think branding is the only way that you stand out and say, this is what I stand for. If you're looking for this, come find me.
Be tricky. I'm just thinking that a lot of times, say that you're shopping online for anything, the first thing you're looking for is price.
Yep.
So, I mean, is that really something that can be advertised?
Well, if you are not the cheapest option, then that means you're not a commodity, which means now you have to say what you are about. There are plenty of categories where people don't just shop on price, in which case it's like, can you say you're the best at something? Are you the one who's the only one who offers this particular feature? Or sometimes it's even like, we've just chosen to focus on this one aspect to kind of cut through the noise.
Are there any methods that you could use to try to shape an algorithm where you would show higher up on a search list on something like that? Say that 10 other people beside you make a product for about the same price, but you want to show up first.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you could do in branding or advertising to maximize that you would be seen first?
I would say that starts to get more into like search engine optimization kind of stuff, which is very much finding the right search terms is a lot based on your own brand messaging, but mostly what your audience is looking for. So that's like a different type of target audience research, which is like, what are people searching in order to find my type of thing? And then what you try to do is kind of corner the market on one phrase or two. Now, what I'm speaking to is more broadly for like Google search engine optimization, but it applies to that as well. If there's any way to learn what terms people are actually searching, that would be an important criteria.